Dr. Valerie O'Connor had barely finished her presentation on the virus cure when Dr. Harold Finch turned to her with a cold smirk. The room of top researchers, all seated at the conference table, seemed to hold its breath. Valerie had just demonstrated how her cure, a simple yet brilliant treatment, could potentially save thousands of lives. But Dr. Finch wasn't impressed. "You're too quiet to lead, Valerie," he said sharply, his voice cutting through the silence. "You lack the presence needed to push this forward." The words stung. Her palms felt clammy as her heart beat faster. His gaze swept over the room, expecting support. The others looked away. Valerie felt herself shrink in front of the very people who should have seen her potential. She was used to being overlooked, but this was a public humiliation. Her throat tightened, her anger rising, but she didn't show it. Instead, she smiled tightly and nodded, all while something fierce stirred inside her. The quietness that had always been her shield would become her weapon. Dr. Finch had just made the biggest mistake of his career. After the meeting, Valerie walked back to her lab, her mind in a whirlwind. The sting of Finch's words echoed in her head. She had always been the quiet one, the one who preferred data over discourse, results over applause. But today, Finch had made it personal. He had questioned her ability to lead, to innovate, and to steer the project she had spent years developing. The worst part? He had done it in front of everyone. She had been overlooked before, sure, but this felt different. This time, she was determined to show them all what she was capable of. Quiet can be powerful, she whispered to herself. Valerie had no plans of confronting Finch immediately. Her revenge would be strategic, methodical. Over the coming days, she buried herself in her work, tightening her cure formula. It would be flawless, and the world would see her contribution, not Finch's. The quiet that had once been her limitation would soon become her most powerful ally. For the next few weeks, Valerie focused on perfecting her cure. The formula was almost there, but she had to refine the mechanism to make it both cost-effective and scalable for global use. She spent sleepless nights at her desk, quietly improving the design, while Finch continued to tout his own leadership skills. Every time he walked by her lab, she could feel his dismissive gaze, but she kept her head down. Valerie wasn't going to waste time on petty arguments or attempts at undermining him. Instead, she quietly took notes, collecting data and refining her findings. No one noticed her moves, not Finch, not her colleagues. And that was exactly the way she wanted it. Slowly, she built momentum, preparing for the day when her silence would speak louder than any of Finch's bluster. Her calm focus on science would outshine his empty rhetoric. She smiled quietly to herself, knowing her time would come. In the evening, as Valerie sat at her desk reviewing the cure's development, her phone buzzed. It was a text from a colleague. "Did you hear Finch just secured the promotion? Guess all that loud talking worked for him after all." Valerie's breath hitched. She wasn't surprised, but it still hurt. Finch had been climbing the corporate ladder on the back of others' work, her work. She stared at the screen, fighting the lump in her throat. There was so much more to her than what he saw. But she wasn't going to let his words, his actions, define her. She put the phone down, wiping away a tear before anyone could see. She wouldn't let Finch take this from her. Her resolve strengthened. It wasn't just about proving him wrong anymore. It was about reclaiming the recognition that was rightfully hers. And she would do it quietly, just like she had always done. But this time, her work would speak for her. Valerie knew she couldn't continue working in silence forever. The breakthrough she was about to make deserved recognition, but she needed the right timing. After weeks of careful planning, she reached out to a trusted colleague at the investor firm that funded their research. Valerie sent them a few discreet emails, offering a preview of her work, including the final iteration of her virus cure. She kept the message concise, just enough to pique their interest. Her idea was simple: if Finch wouldn't recognize her, she would go directly to those who would. Within a few days, Valerie received a response. A private meeting was set for the following week. No one at the company knew about this, not even Dr. Finch. Valerie felt a rush of triumph. She wasn't going to just work in the shadows anymore. She would prove her worth and show the world that quiet determination could achieve monumental things. The meeting was set. Valerie walked into the conference room with only her laptop and a small briefcase containing the latest research on her cure. She had rehearsed every word in her head. She had already predicted what questions they might ask. As she presented her findings, the room fell silent. The investors' eyes widened as Valerie discussed the scalability of her cure, its global potential, and the social impact it could have on undeserved populations. Valerie's quiet confidence filled the room. She answered their questions effortlessly, knowing that every word she spoke would push her closer to the breakthrough she deserved. By the time the meeting ended, the investors were eager to continue discussions. Valerie had succeeded. She was no longer just the quiet scientist. My chief scientist said I was too quiet to lead, then my quiet virus cure invention ended his promotion. In the corner. She was an innovator, a leader, and someone who would change the world. And Finch? He wouldn't even see it coming. The next few days were tense. Valerie could feel the shift. Finch was busy parading his promotion around the office, talking about the new responsibilities he'd be taking on. He was oblivious to the work Valerie had been quietly perfecting. He probably thought she was still in the background, a shadow behind his grand ideas. But Valerie knew something he didn't. She had already spoken to the investors, and they were impressed. They were waiting for her cue. The pressure was starting to build, and Finch's overconfidence was becoming his weakness. Every time he walked into the lab, Valerie could sense his arrogance, but she stayed calm. Her plan was coming together, piece by piece, and Finch's mistakes were starting to pile up. He had taken credit for things that weren't his, and Valerie's silence was beginning to work to her advantage. Soon, the world would see her work, not his. Valerie sat in her lab, her fingers trembling slightly as she adjusted the final test for her cure. The virus had been elusive for so long, but now, she could see the answer in front of her. This was her moment, the breakthrough she had been working towards for years. Every failure, every doubt, had led her to this point. She felt a rush of excitement mixed with a deep sense of calm. The cure worked. It was a simple, elegant solution to a complex problem. No more complex machinery, no more dependency on unreliable systems. Just a clean, efficient design. Her heart raced as she finalized the data, entering the numbers into the computer. For the first time in a long while, she felt the weight of what she had accomplished. This was going to change the world. But she knew this was just the beginning. She couldn't just tell Finch. He'd never acknowledge her work, and she didn't need his approval. The world would know her name soon enough. With a final click, she sent the data to her investor contact. "It's ready," she whispered, her voice full of purpose. Days passed after Valerie's breakthrough, and Dr. Finch's promotion seemed imminent. Valerie knew what he was up to. He'd been making moves behind the scenes, pushing himself forward, even taking credit for projects that weren't his. His arrogance was hard to ignore, but Valerie refused to let it distract her. She had a plan. The cure would speak for itself. As she walked through the lab, she overheard a conversation between two colleagues. They were talking about Finch's promotion and how he was already planning his next big move. Valerie's stomach tightened. She couldn't let this happen. Not without recognition. The investors were still silent, waiting for her signal. She needed to do more than just sit quietly. She needed a final push. She began preparing her presentation, knowing that once the world saw the cure, Finch would have no choice but to acknowledge her work. The tension in her chest was growing, but she remained calm, focused on her goal. The time for waiting was over. Late one night, Valerie found herself sitting in front of her computer, staring at the data. The cure was perfect, but something still gnawed at her. Doubts crept in, not about the science, but about herself. Was she really the one who could lead this project? Could she stand up to Finch and the board? She had been quiet for so long, always watching from the sidelines. Her thoughts swirled, questioning whether she could take the next step. Maybe Finch was right, maybe she wasn't cut out for this. But then, she thought about how far she had come. All the years of hard work, the nights spent in the lab, the sacrifices she had made. She wasn't going to let one person's words define her. Valerie stood up, determination flooding her veins. She wasn't just a quiet scientist. She was a leader in the making. And if the world wouldn't see it yet, she would make them. The day of the presentation arrived. Valerie stood in front of a small group of investors, feeling the weight of the moment. She didn't need a flashy performance or dramatic speech. She just needed to present the facts. The cure was groundbreaking. The data spoke for itself. As she clicked through the slides, explaining the simplicity and effectiveness of her design, she could see the investors' interest growing. They asked questions, but Valerie answered them with ease, her confidence growing as the minutes ticked by. Dr. Finch's name was never mentioned, and that felt like victory in itself. By the time Valerie finished, the room was silent. Then, one of the investors spoke up. "This could change everything. We want to move forward with it." Valerie couldn't help but smile. She had done it. She hadn't shouted or demanded attention. She had let her work do the talking. And now, her cure was going to the next stage. Valerie's presentation had been a success, but now came the hard part. Dr. Finch had no idea what was coming. Valerie had to stay quiet, watch as he made his arrogant moves, and wait for the right moment to strike. It didn't take long for Finch to start claiming credit for the work Valerie had done. She heard whispers in the hallways, people talking about Finch's promotion and how he was already planning a new project. Valerie clenched her fists but didn't react. She knew that the only way to truly get her revenge was through her actions, not words. And so, she waited, silently moving forward. She continued her work, keeping a close eye on Finch and waiting for him to make his inevitable mistake. The tension between them grew, but Valerie stayed calm, focused. Every day, she got closer to her goal, and every day, Finch's arrogance pushed him further from it. It happened sooner than Valerie expected. Dr. Finch, in his usual arrogant fashion, made a critical mistake during a presentation to a group of board members. He claimed ownership of Valerie's research, citing her data as if it were his own. The investors had already seen her work, though, and they weren't fooled. One of them, a sharp-eyed woman, caught the mistake and questioned Finch. "But this was developed by Dr. O'Connor, wasn't it?" she asked. The room went silent. Finch's face turned pale. Valerie stood outside the room, her heart pounding. She knew the truth was out, and Finch's bluff had been called. The next few days were a whirlwind. The board reviewed the evidence, and Valerie's cure became the focal point of all discussions. Finch's promotion was suddenly in jeopardy, and Valerie's quiet victory was just beginning. As the days passed, Finch's behavior grew more erratic. He began scrambling to save face, but the damage had already been done. Valerie, on the other hand, remained calm and composed. She continued her work, making sure that the cure's development was moving forward. The more Finch tried to cover his tracks, the more obvious it became that he had been taking credit for someone else's work. Valerie's silence spoke louder than ever. She let him dig his own grave, knowing that his arrogance would be his downfall. The board members were now scrutinizing every move Finch made, and it wasn't long before they realized how much of the research had been Valerie's. Finch was being exposed for what he was, a fraud. Valerie's rise was slow but sure, and Finch's fall was inevitable. Inch, desperate to regain control, began playing his old tricks. He started turning up. Valerie could feel the tension building with every passing day. Dr. F. the heat in meetings, loudly claiming that Valerie's cure was too risky and unproven. He made sure to highlight her quiet demeanor as if that somehow made her ideas less valid. Valerie, however, refused to let it get to her. She kept her focus on her work. The more Finch attacked, the clearer it became to Valerie that his true intentions were finally exposed. He had always been a puppet master, taking credit for others' efforts while staying in the background. Valerie had long ago stopped expecting fairness from him. She focused on the task at hand. Her investors had already seen the proof, and they were now more invested than ever in her work. The pressure on Finch was mounting, and Valerie knew it wouldn't be long before he made another mistake. Every word he spoke was becoming more and more hollow. Valerie's silence was her strongest weapon. And Finch's lies were unraveling. The moment came unexpectedly. Valerie had been working late into the night, fine-tuning the prototype when she received a call from the investor who had initially met with her. They were thrilled with her progress, but they were concerned about Finch's influence in the project. "We're wondering if you're ready to present your work at the International Health Summit," the investor said. "But there's something you need to know. Finch is trying to position himself as the lead researcher. The board is being influenced by his pressure." Valerie didn't flinch. Her revenge wasn't going to be loud or dramatic. She would take Finch's role, not by storming in with a power play, but by doing the one thing he couldn't do, delivering real results. She agreed to the summit presentation, silently knowing that her quiet success would overshadow Finch's clamor. As Valerie prepared for the summit, she kept her focus sharp. She didn't need to say anything to Finch. He would see it all when the world did. The power of her work would be undeniable. The quiet revenge was taking shape, one calculated move at a time. It happened fast. The week before the summit, the board held a review meeting. Finch had been pushing to delay the project, claiming the data was incomplete, but Valerie's research was already ahead of schedule. The summit was a perfect opportunity to showcase her work, and she knew this was her moment. During the board meeting, she sat quietly in the back of the room, listening to Finch argue and attempt to downplay her findings. When it was Valerie's turn to speak, she stood confidently, presenting her results with a calm professionalism that Finch could never replicate. She discussed the cure's potential, its adaptability, and its real-world applications. The room fell silent. When Valerie finished, she noticed the shift. The board members, who had once been swayed by Finch's charisma, were now looking at her with genuine respect. Finch's arguments were falling flat. Valerie had quietly stolen the spotlight. And just as she suspected, the board began to question Finch's leadership. His overconfidence had led him to overstep, and now he was being exposed for not having the results to back up his boasts. Valerie smiled to herself, knowing her quiet strategy had won the day. The following week at the summit, Valerie took center stage. She stood before a room full of investors, doctors, and media professionals, ready to reveal her cure to the world. The atmosphere was thick with anticipation, but Valerie remained calm. As she unveiled the cure, she could see the shock in their faces as her work was finally revealed. The audience was mesmerized. It wasn't just the scientific community that took notice, the media was all over it. News outlets started covering her innovation, and social media buzzed with praise. Valerie's quiet strength was finally on display for the world to see. But the most satisfying moment came when Dr. Finch walked into the auditorium, presumably to show support. His face fell as he realized the audience's attention was no longer on him. His promotion, his claims to leadership, were completely overshadowed. Valerie's calm presentation had done what her quiet revenge couldn't: take away his spotlight. His arrogance, once seen as confidence, was now exposed as incompetence. The press had latched onto Valerie's success, and Finch was nothing more than a footnote in the story. Back at the company, Finch's position began to erode rapidly. As the media coverage continued to rise around Valerie's work, the board couldn't ignore the growing pressure. Valerie had become a national hero, and her cure was being hailed as a major breakthrough in the fight against the virus. Finch, on the other hand, was under fire. The board began reviewing his past work and discovered numerous discrepancies in his claims. Worse, his inability to lead the team during critical moments became all too apparent. Valerie was still the quiet, humble scientist she'd always been, but now, she held the reins of the project. The board finally made their decision. Finch's promotion was rescinded, and he was quietly reassigned to a lower position within the company. The public humiliation was complete. Valerie hadn't needed to shout to create drama. Her work, her quiet strength, had done all the talking. Finch's downfall was a result of his own arrogance, and Valerie's rise came from her dedication, her brilliance, and her quiet determination. As the months passed, Valerie took over Finch's responsibilities with grace. She began leading the team with a steady hand, using her knowledge and experience to push the project further. The cure was being distributed globally, and Valerie was at the forefront of every decision. Finch, meanwhile, struggled in his new position. His colleagues avoided him, and his once stellar reputation was in tatters. It was a slow burn of justice, watching him slip into irrelevance. Valerie continued to work tirelessly, but now, there was no question who the real leader was. As she reviewed the latest data on the cure's success rate in remote areas, she realized how far she had come. She was no longer the quiet scientist in the corner. She was the leader of a global initiative. And Finch's downfall? It had been inevitable. His arrogance had blinded him, and now, his mistakes were costing him everything. Valerie's quiet victory was sweeter than any public confrontation could have been. The international recognition kept pouring in. Valerie's cure was being implemented in hospitals worldwide, and her leadership was being celebrated by the medical community. Her quiet nature had proven to be her greatest asset. She had never needed to raise her voice or make threats. Her work spoke for itself. Dr. Finch, meanwhile, had all but disappeared from the public eye. He was relegated to a secondary role, forgotten by the company and the media. Valerie, on the other hand, was being invited to conferences, interviewed by top journals, and even awarded for her innovation. But through it all, she remained humble. She never sought out the attention, she simply focused on what mattered, making the world a better place. Finch's downfall was complete, and Valerie had achieved something far greater than he ever could have imagined, true leadership born from intelligence, integrity, and a quiet, unshakable resolve. As the months passed, Valerie's position at the company grew stronger. She had successfully taken over the leadership of the project, and the team now looked to her for guidance. The cure was not only saving lives but was also becoming a symbol of quiet innovation. Meanwhile, Dr. Finch's situation had taken a drastic turn for the worse. His earlier claims to success were now exposed as hollow, and the board began to investigate his previous work. It wasn't long before they uncovered more issues with his past projects, things he had covered up, misrepresented, or simply failed to deliver on. Finch's promotion was revoked, and his access to the company's critical resources was suspended. But the most satisfying part was seeing how Valerie had earned what Finch had taken for granted. His arrogance had cost him everything. Valerie, on the other hand, had earned her place through hard work, quiet leadership, and innovation. As she stood in front of the board one final time, giving her presentation on the cure's global rollout, she couldn't help but feel a deep sense of satisfaction. Finch had lost everything, not because of her, but because of his own pride. Justice had been served, not through confrontation, but through success and integrity. The news of Finch's downfall spread like wildfire throughout the company and beyond. Valerie had become a name to be reckoned with, while Finch's reputation crumbled. It was during a company-wide meeting that Valerie truly understood the depth of his failure. She had been invited to speak about the success of the cure at the annual company conference. As she prepared to take the stage, she glanced over at Finch. He was sitting at the back of the room, his face pale, a hollow shell of the confident man who had once belittled her. For a moment, Valerie felt a rush of triumph. This was the final moment, the final blow. She stood in front of the crowd, the spotlight on her, her cure now a global phenomenon. As she spoke, Valerie didn't waste time addressing Finch's downfall. She didn't need to. She simply focused on the work, the science, the impact, and the people whose lives had been changed. The crowd erupted in applause as she finished her speech. In that moment, Valerie knew she had won. Finch had been exposed for what he truly was, someone who used others to climb higher, but who ultimately couldn't back up his claims. Valerie's success was hers alone. Her quiet victory was the final justice she needed. In the aftermath of the conference, the company's leadership team began shifting. Valerie was promoted to chief scientist, the position Finch had so desperately wanted. As she walked into her new office, Valerie took a moment to reflect on how far she had come. Her journey had never been about seeking revenge or tearing others down. It had always been about proving herself, showing the world that being quiet didn't mean being weak. The world had finally seen her for what she was, a leader, an innovator, and a person whose strength was built from within. Finch, on the other hand, had been left behind. He was now a shadow of his former self, his career at a standstill. Valerie's rise was not only a personal triumph but a testament to the idea that hard work and quiet determination could achieve greatness. She was now in a position to lead the team that would continue developing life-saving technologies, making an even greater impact on the world. And all of it had been achieved without raising her voice or seeking approval. Her quiet revolution had not only redefined her career but had also reshaped the entire company. Months later, Valerie stood at the head of a large table in a boardroom, surrounded by a group of scientists and investors. The cure was now in full-scale production, and it was being distributed across the globe. Valerie had led the project from the beginning, and the results were more impressive than anyone could have imagined. People were walking again, getting the treatment they needed, and entire communities were being saved from a virus that had once seemed unstoppable. As Valerie reviewed the final reports, a knock on her door interrupted her thoughts. It was one of her colleagues, a young scientist who had been with the team from the start. "Dr. O'Connor," he said with a smile, "the impact report just came in. It's amazing. We've saved more lives than we expected. This is bigger than we thought." Valerie nodded, her eyes shining with quiet pride. She had known this would happen. She had always believed in the power of her work. She had never needed to shout to be heard. The world had finally seen her for who she truly was, someone who changed the world with her quiet brilliance. As the team gathered around her, discussing the future of the cure and its next phase, Valerie looked out of the window. The city was bustling below, but in that moment, she felt completely at peace. She had done it. She had won not with noise, not with anger, but with the power of her mind, her integrity, and her quiet determination. And that was all she had ever needed. The door to her office closed quietly behind her as she left for the day, a small, satisfied smile on her face. The world had seen her. And now, the world would never forget her.